The next presenter is Thomas Van Hoey from the University of Hong Kong. Can you share your screen? Oh, yeah, you are.
Yeah. Do you see the full screen or the presenter view?
It's a full screen, I think. So
okay, yeah,
his topic is ABB, a salient prototype of collocate-ideophone constructions in Mandarin Chinese. Okay, please.
Hi, nice to meet you all. I also got a notification that my internet is unstable, so I hope I don't fall away. So I'm going to be talking about ABB words, which I will argue are salient prototypes of collocate-ideophone constructions in Mandarin Chinese. The main idea is basically that we shouldn't forget about lexical effects when we are doing work on iconicity. So not just focusing on iconic effects or which ones are sound symbolic. So keep that in mind as I go along. Okay. I use a Japanese example here in the beginning because I assume that most people would be familiar with Japanese. So Kimi in 2012 has talked about the collocates of ideophones through the lens of frame semantics. For instance, here, 彼女はスタスタと歩いてくる, where you have the verb aruku, which is the prosaic collocate of the mimetic or the ideophone stasuta, which indicates that the manner of walking is very briskly in small steps. So, and it's also thought that mimetics are highly restrictive in their prosaic collocates. So they often specify or elaborate the collocate. There is often also some grammatical redundancy. So this comes from Mark Digemas's work. So it's not necessary to add this ideophone, but if you do add them on stage, you often either say the same semantic information or you specify it, but it's grounded in depiction rather than description. So it's not super redundant, actually. So the highly specific collocation of ideophones means that there is often this one-to-one mapping between the frames evoked in collocate and ideophone, or of course, sometimes different collocates can occur with different ideophones that elaborate the manner in which these collocates happen. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Chinese. So Sinitic languages also have these ideophones with lexical preferences in terms of prosaic collocates, but there is actually a challenge in the field because ideophones are typically not very recognized in traditional Chinese linguistic studies. They're kind of pushed to the margins. So sometimes, well, people will talk about onomatopoeia, which are very salient, but I think there are also really ideophones that are belong to other sensory domains as well. So, but then, of course, it doesn't mean that the phenomenon itself isn't there. So they do talk about things like ABB words. So you can see here in Mandarin, Cantonese, Southern Min, and Hakka. In green, you have this prosaic collocate, he, hak, o, head, which all mean dark or black. And then you have this reduplicated part, chi, chi, ma, ma, so, so, and so, so, which is very vivid, and together they form this construction of ABB, because that's what the characters look like. And the folk model of Chinese also uses, well, one syllable is one character is one meaning or one morpheme. So that's kind of something that has seeped into Chinese traditional linguistics, and that has made its way also to ABB, and what I think should actually be more viewed from a more iconicity perspective. So let's first talk about a little bit about like how this works in these traditional studies. Namely, they will talk about derivational analyses. So that means it's kind of like playing with Legos. For instance, the first one on the top right, you have kan papa, kan meaning dry, and papa doesn't really have a meaning. So that one, they will say, okay, this is a clear example of an A plus a BB. But sometimes like the second one, tian mi mi, tian mi. So the first and the second of those two, of those three syllables or characters, they also form a unit. So they will say the B is actually just an empty copy of the second one. Same for huolala, the third one, meaning spicy or hot. Yo ni ni, greasy. Sometimes you have patterns like BA, like xiang pen pen, and you also have the word pen xiang. So you have to turn it around, and then with kind of like a rule list kind of framework, derive these things from each other. Sometimes also reductive in a sense. So you have a pattern like AABB, then minus A. So ping ping YY becomes ping YY. So it's really all about the structure, and people don't really take the meaning into account. So I think the better way to looking at this is actually having the A plus the BB part, and then sometimes other schemas as well. But first, a quote from reference grammar from 2016 that also talks about derivation by affixation. And so they say, this is to add to the root a suffix in the shape of a repeated syllable, like hong hong in cho hong hong, meaning very stinky. Such a suffix typically does not have a very clear semantic content, but does make a distinctive contribution to the overall meaning of the derived adjective. So that is to say, in ABB words, we know that they're more vivid. There's a special meaning as opposed to just having A. But we don't know what's happening with BB. And I think that's really the problem of description versus depiction, because depiction is often hard to define, but you kind of feel that there is something there. To go along with the idea of if they are truly affixes, these BB elements, well, then they probably should behave like typical affixes as well in Mandarin. And as you can see from this table, they don't. Typical affixes in Mandarin are bound, usually cannot be stressed, are highly selective to the items to which they attach. They don't really integrate in the phonological shape of a word to which they are a part of, except for maybe, but that's just the nature of Chinese. But then BB elements are only highly selective for the items to which they attach, and often they're unbound. Some of them are bound, but it's kind of a stretch to then say like, oh, because some of them are bound, that means all of them are bound. So they're typical affixes. So I don't think that's a good way of analyzing them. What is a better way? Thinking of them as compounds. So if we leave the purely structural terms and rules and lists and compositions behind, we can maybe see their compounds, as has also been argued by other Chinese linguists like Zhào and Wang. So that means instead of analyzing hey chi chi with hey meaning black and chi chi meaning pitch black or super dark, chi by itself means lacquer, by the way, the black paint you put on the terracotta army, for instance. So I would say we should analyze this as hey plus chi chi rather than hey plus an empty suffix chi chi that we don't know the meaning of. I think that's important to view it that way, because if you view them as compounds, then you open up the question of, well, what attracts what from both directions? Because if you just view them as suffixes, then you might just be focusing on the way what kind of heads can fit the pattern rather than looking at it from both ways. But then at the same time, we do need to recognize that there are words like yonini, which are completely transparent. So yonini means greasy, yo means oil or oily, nini means greasy, ni means grease or greasy. So these things are very clear. People have no problems understanding them. On the other end of this line between transparency and opacity, you can see the example of kan papa that I also talked about before. So kan means dry. Papa doesn't really have unit status in the sense of Langecker. So we don't have a meaning associated with it. Also not with one syllable there, pa, we don't know. So so that's a case where you have the whole, but you don't have the parts. And then there are also middle cases where you like tian mi mi, where tian means sweet, and mi mi also means sweet, but mi by itself means honey. Now imagine if you don't know that mi means honey, then that is not truly transparent. So that would be more towards the opaque side. But if you do know, then it's more towards the transparent side. But in any case, for me, honey to go to the meaning of sweet in mi mi, you have to do some kind of metonymic conversion. So that's also a middle ground there. And I also added here for yonini, the item yoni, which is AB from the structural term. So you can still have these more structural Lego like schemas, right? It's just you make use of the same material, but you add it to a different conceptual schema. Yeah. So going along then with the idea that they're not really derivations, but compounds. Well, they are compounds of collocates and ideophones. And it's actually quite kind of curious because there is already since the 1970s that people have been saying that ABB items are argued to be the basic form in which sound symbolism in synthic languages could be fruitfully explored. So it has a long history of being analyzed like that. Also in 2001, Enid Waiting Mok talked about Mandarin, Cantonese, and Hakka, and she said that ABB should actually be written or in notation as XAA, indicating that X really is like the prosaic collocate and AA is the idiophonic part. So it's interesting that these observations also come from Hong Kong or Chinese people, but they're more used to Western linguistics rather than this traditional Chinese linguistics. So I hope somehow I can help to bridge the apparent inconsumability between these two perspectives. This quote is the rest of the quote that I also talked about before, which use these purely structural terms. So even then with these empty suffixes, they still talk about the vividness. So hong hong indicating that it's emitting a foul smell constantly and heavily, or pong pong, which is like releasing a sweet scent continuously and extensively. So I think for most of us in this workshop, when you see the word vivid, you automatically think idiophone. This is a still from Lockwood's dissertation in 2017. So I think it does make sense to say, okay, we are dealing with collocate-idiophone compounds or constructions. And let's put that now in a usage-based perspective. So typically the previous material and previous studies will use a word list of about 300 ABB items coming from dictionaries, etc. And they do make some predictions. So they find, for instance, for 醉醺醺, which means very drunk, 醉 is drunk, that there's only one idiophone that collocates with it. For 醺醺, they only find like one prosaic collocate. So that's like a one-to-one relationship. Sometimes you also have one-to-n relationships. For instance, black can have chi chi, shu shu, or mong mong as it's collocating idiophones. You can also have different idiophones for different prosaic collocates for the same idiophone, like bai mong mong, hui mong mong, and hei mong mong, where mong mong means unclear, and bai, hui, and hei is white, gray, and black. So you can kind of see that there is this interconnectedness of them, right? End-to-end mappings, you have those as well. I would say probably that even with this wordless approach, you can see that hey chi chi, hey shu shu, and hey mamong, there is probably something sound symbolic going on with the different collocating idiophones there. But what that exactly is still remains to be seen, I think. So we start from this wordless material, but let's put it more in a usage-based paradigm. So we can make some predictions, of course. We expect to find the things that were also found in the wordless approach, and also to find more things, because usage-based typically involves corpora, observable data, right? So you typically get more, but it will be more messy. And the spoiler alert here is that indeed we find those things. So I don't want to talk too much about this. I will talk about the material, the Chinese idiophone database, which I developed together with a colleague of mine, Arthur Lewis Thompson, and then also the Academia Sinica Balanced Corpus of Modern Chinese, which has about 10 million words, which are mostly hand annotated. And it's useful if you have a whole corpus available, because you can do lots of interesting stats. So the research objectives kind of are, with this expanded usage material, we can investigate the frequencies of constructions, exemplars, dispersion in the corpus as well, and also the attraction between collocates and idiophones and vice versa. But then I thought, well, maybe we should also expand the types. So just not just look at the base pattern, which is now XAA, formerly ABB, this prosaic collocate, and the full reduplicated idiophonic part. Instead, we can probably also include partially reduplicated idiophones of 2 syllables. So that means rhyming items. So there's a rhyme between A and B, or alliteration between A and B. And on the prosaic side, I thought, well, I can also expand that. So I expanded up until 4 characters above that. So to operationalize what I would search for in the corpus. Yeah. So the idea is then that we have this network, right? So as on top, we have the collocate-ideophone construction with lower level patterns being these XAA, XAB, XYAB, etc. And they all vary in terms of thickness of lines and kind of lines. So the thickest line for XAA, what we would expect is that this would be the most frequent one in terms of type frequency or token frequency. Maybe also for XYAA, XAB, etc. But things like XYZWAA, those kind of patterns might not be present in people's minds, and also will probably not be very frequent in the corpus. That's on the level of constructions. On the level of exemplars, we can argue for the same kind of thing. So by II, Snow White will be very frequent, but we also might find things like Bai Xue II, which also means Snow White, literally with snow included here. Xue is snow. But things like 小朋友踊跃 which means like the little kid is like waiting to speak or something, like might not be very frequent, and also might not be really apprehended as an instance of collocate-ideophone constructions. So that's the idea. So the operationalization of this is very simple. You just count things. And we do indeed find that XAA is very frequent, both in type frequency and token frequency. Also XYAB and XYAA, which I think is interesting because that means the trisyllabic pattern, like XAA or ABB as it was usually known, that would make sense, because like it stands out because it's 3 characters. That's already kind of special in Chinese. And then also it makes sense that like so much literature has been devoted to it. It's easily recognizable. Also tetrasyllabic items, they were not really discussed in the literature, but of course a tetrasyllabic pattern in Chinese is very common. Lots of idioms have that, like think of 井底之蛙, a frog in the well. Those kind of things are very common, and often ideophones also belong or occur in those patterns. Yeah. At the level of exemplars, we can also count things. So one way to do that would be token frequency. How often do we find a word in the corpus? But also dispersion, which is actually the relative frequency of a word across different corpus parts. And I operationalized that with the callback-library divergence following Greece. But I don't want to go into the statistics. I want to focus more on the story here, but feel free to ask me later on. The idea is basically if you have 2 words like enormous and staining in English, enormous will be more well-known and more applicable to different situations. So it will have a higher dispersion, more widely dispersed. But even in the case that it has the same token frequency as a word like staining, that word staining might only occur in one corpus part to talk about wood staining, for instance. So that will have a low dispersion. So that's kind of like a correction on top of token frequency. So I would just say be cautious with token frequencies, because as it shows here on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, we can see that most items are pretty well dispersed. So that's a good thing. But there is a trade-off, because the more frequent they are, that's on the vertical axis, the less well dispersed they are. So that kind of indicates that very frequent items are probably more confined to a different, or to a single topical genre, while lower frequent items may occur like more across the corpus. I don't really know why that is, but it does maybe make sense because ideophones are pretty specific. I also don't find that many tokens of ABB words or ideophones in the corpus. Maybe that's just because it's mostly written data. I don't know. That's something that still needs to be figured out. Let's talk about selectional preferences of ideophones. To think back of our suta to argu example in the beginning, different collocate-ideophone constructions have different degrees of selectional preferences. So we can do that from ideophone to collocate and from collocate to ideophone. And I would analyze that through association measures. So like covariant collocates from the constructional framework is what I used here, namely things like Q validity. how that works is also you count how many times hey and chi-chi co-occur, how many times does hey co-occur with other ideophones, how many times does chi-chi co-occur with other collocates, and then the rest. You count these things and then you run some formula. Once again, talk about later if you want. But the main idea is you get this kind of plot where each dot represents a combination of an idiophone and a collocate, well, a collocate and an idiophone. And remember, Zui Xunxun to be very drunk. It was predicted that that was like a one-on-one relationship. So that means that when I type in Zui, like I would only find Zui Xunxun. When I type in Xunxun, I would only find Zui Xunxun. And that's exactly what we find. So that's a good sign. That means that the wordless approach is somewhat correct, right? We can kind of corroborate this. The value is also 1, 1. So they truly have this like this 100% Q validity. If I give you the collocate Zui, then and I tell you I need an ABB, then you will give me Xun Xun as the answer and the other way around. But more interestingly, we can look at other items like hey chi chi. So if I give you hey, then on the left panel you can see all the answers there. So all the other idiophonic items that co-occur with it. I think it's also interesting for learners of Chinese. They can focus on the ones that are on top or on the right first. So things that are on the lower left bottom, like don't bother with them, like they won't occur in your life. So like this way, like we can also maybe turn this into some kind of pedagogy, like application. But from the perspective of Chi-Chi, which is actually what I'm more interested in, I think from the word list, it was predicted as well that there's only hey chi-chi, pitch black. But actually, we also find other collocates like an and u, and they both mean dark or black. So this kind of shows that this dynamic nature of the corpus, this usage-based approach is better or more encompassing than just a word list. But it's also interesting because it opens up new avenues for semantic studies. Hey black, am dark, and u dark, like they're all kind of the same semantic domain, but we just have more material. So that really does tell us something about the nature of chi-chi, which you can also explore then with other items as well. And that's basically what I said here. Okay, I'm almost there. So discussion and conclusion. So what did I do in this study? I did 3 major things. So I tried to argue that it's not really derivation with empty suffixes, but more compounds involving a prosaic collocational element and an idiophonic element. Then I expanded that to just other types, other constructions of collocate idiophone constructions. And then I put that in a usage-based perspective, which I think is better than just a dictionary word list. But the main idea is that there is this differences of salience all throughout the field on whatever level I'm looking at. So on the level of constructional patterns, we find the main ones here, XAA and so on. Also at the level of collocate idiophone exemplars, you can find that, which you can just do through counting and different other statistical measures as a start for like other research, of course, but also selectional preferences between collocate and idiophone. The nature of corpus data is usually that it's very messy, but you can capture some order in there through Q validity. So if I added the idea of like, I'm giving you a collocate, which is the most likely answer in terms of idiophones. I'm giving you an idiophone, which is the most likely answer in terms of collocates. And I like that it really corroborates the previous word list studies, but it really goes beyond that as well. And it really opens up this this whole new field of like looking at data. So I'm happy for the future. Also, other future research is actually the most pressing question that I need to do or need to answer is whether these findings from the corpus are also reflected in the minds of speakers. And so what I've been doing afterwards is actually a bunch of rating studies, so decontextualized items, to see if people get the same kind of structures there, and also if this is comparable, but that's still in the works. So anyway, I'd like to thank you for your attention. There is a preprint, so if you follow this link, you can get there. I also shared my slides on on the Slack. So yeah. And I would like to thank my lab at HKU, also my previous lab at NTU, and also the very linguistic talks that where I've practiced this before. Thank you.